Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Today is Friday, March 20th, 2026. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Steven Pifer, who was the third United States ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000, and is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe. Welcome, Steve. How are you?
Happy to be here, Mike.
Thank you so much for joining us. To start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your professional career?
Well, after I graduated from university, I entered the Foreign Service and spent 27 years as a career Foreign Service officer, mainly focused on Europe. My overseas postings were Warsaw, Moscow, London, and Kyiv. I did quite a bit on nuclear arms control in the 1980s when I was working on the NATO desk. And that's what actually got me to Moscow as a position at the embassy there for following arms control. And it was a pretty interesting time to be in Moscow, 86 to 88, with Gorbachev, and things were opening up. And then in the 90s, ended up working for Strobe Talbot, the ambassador at large for the new independent states, served on the National Security Council, and from there went to Kyiv in 1998.
Steve, how has Ukraine changed since you were the U.S. ambassador from 1998 to 2000?
Well, in a lot of ways. First of all, of course, you didn't have the war going on. I think it's changed though it made a lot more progress in terms of the kind of reforms that it needed after it became independent in 1991. So, by the time of when I arrived in 1998, the Ukrainian economy was still going through a very difficult period. And I think part of the problem was, and I can understand that the government was reluctant to kind of impose the kind of reforms that were necessary to move from a command economy to a more of a free market economy. And so, whereas a country like Poland sort of compressed that period 4 or 5 years, in Ukraine it stretched out to 8 or 9 years. And so the economy really didn't start growing until about 2000, after 9 very difficult years. Part of it was, getting in place the mechanism of the market economy. One thing that I saw that really happened, I guess, probably about 2001, was former collective farms, which had been sort of privatized in 1991, really kind of operated like collective farms. But I remember flying into Kyiv at one point, I think it was 2001, 2005, somewhere in that point, where you could look down at the patterns and you could see, instead of the large collective farm patterns, in fact, they had truly privatized, and you could see smaller patches and giving people then the right to own that land, either farm it themselves or rent it or sell it. And I think you begin to see changes that gave the Ukrainian economy a pretty good boost in the early 2000s in terms of economic growth. I think the other thing that we saw, and I was not surprised by things like either the Orange Revolution or the Maidan Revolution, because you could tell even in the late 90s that Ukrainians really had this desire to have a political voice. And I remember going, one of the things that I did was when there were elections, I served as an election monitor for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And talking to people running those local election precincts, they really were committed. We want to have, a free, fair election here. And in some kinds, it was messy. I remember going into one place, and a husband and wife were discussing in the election site the conversation they should have had that morning at home about who to vote for. But it's still that people were really, I think, trying to make the election work, and it reflected the desire of Ukrainians to have a real political voice, which I think they made very clear both in 2004 and then again in 2014. And then I guess the last thing I think that's changed, of course, is Ukraine's place in the world. When I was there, I'd say Ukraine was still trying to figure out exactly where it wanted to be. It hadn't decided where it wanted to have links with the West, but it also had the relationship with Russia. Of course, at that time, you were dealing with Boris Yeltsin, who had many flaws, but Yeltsin, I think, still basically accepted Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state within the boundaries it had in 1991. Vladimir Putin did not do that. And so it's a much more difficult foreign relationship, although I think because of things done back in the 90s and early 2000s, Ukraine does have quite a bit of support in the West in its conflict with Russia.
What is your current assessment of the Russian invasion against Ukraine?
What I think people sometimes get wrong is this idea that Russia is winning and it's only a matter of time. I mean, if you look today, Russia holds about 19% of Ukraine's territory. That's actually one third less than Ukraine occupied back, I'm sorry, than Russia occupied back in March of 2022, before Ukrainian counteroffensives drove the Russians out of the northern part of Ukraine, out of Kharkiv, and out of the part of Kherson province that was on the northwest side of the Dnipro River. And if you look at Russian advances, I mean, I suspect the Russians, by most calculations, have occupied an additional 2% of territory since 2023, over 3 years. But they paid an enormous cost for doing that. Over 1.2 million Russian soldiers killed or severely wounded in action. I mean, that's an astonishing number. The big surprise for the Russians, and quite frankly, I think for most of the people, I mean, the expectations back in February 22 was that, the Ukrainian military would be fairly quickly defeated. I have to confess, my own assessment was that Ukraine would probably lose the force-on-force fight in 2 or 3 months, but then the Russians would be faced with this very long and bloody insurgency that would go on for decades. But the Ukrainians, I think, surprised everybody. And so I look at the situation now, and I think, Ukraine still has the capacity to surprise. And particularly in part because Ukraine is fighting largely on the defensive, it is not a surprise that the Russians are taking much heavier casualties than the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians have shown not only bravery and skill, but remarkable innovation. I mean, this whole concept of changing the warfare and ground warfare with the use of drones. And the drones, I think, give the Ukrainians the opportunity to make up for some of the manpower shortages that they may have. And then just, some areas that I think have been a true surprise. I mean, Ukraine effectively has won the battle for the Black Sea, which is surprising because when the war began, or when the major invasion began in 2022, Ukraine's navy had only one major surface combatant, which was scuttled, I think, on day 4 of the war to prevent it from being captured by the Russians. But using anti-ship missiles, using various types of drones, other types of missiles, they've sunk on nearly 30 major ships of the Black Sea Fleet, driven the Black Sea Fleet largely out of Sevastopol. It now has to basically home port in Novorossiysk, out of range of Ukrainian attacks. I think that's something that people would not have predicted. So those who think that it's only a matter of time before Russia wins, I'm not sure that they're correct. I think the Ukrainians have most of anything. I mean, they have a will that the Russians do not have. I mean, I think Ukrainians see this war as an existential fight, and they are prepared to continue that. What I am disappointed in is the negotiating process. I thought that when President Trump began this last year, there was an opportunity perhaps to secure an end to the war, but I've now concluded that the negotiating process is failing. It's failing because Mr. Trump has failed to back his diplomacy with pressure on Moscow. If you look at the course of the negotiations over the past 5 or 6 months, I think it's pretty clear Ukraine is prepared to make concessions, including perhaps the very painful decision of accepting some de facto loss of territory. Russia has made no comparable movement. In fact, if you look at, I think, a talk that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov gave maybe 6 weeks ago, he articulated Russian demands that are exactly the same as the demands that Vladimir Putin articulated back in the summer of 2024. And so if you're trying to, if the US wants to encourage a settlement, it needs to find a way to pressure Moscow, where I think Vladimir Putin still thinks he can achieve his goals on the battlefield. And I think the West needs to help Ukraine disabuse Putin of that notion and persuade him that he's going to fail on the battlefield and he's only going to encounter growing political, economic, and military costs. But thus far, there's been little sign that Mr. Trump is prepared to put the necessary pressure on Mr. Putin. And therefore, I think his mediation effort is going to continue to fail.
Will the temporary lifting of U.S. Russian oil sanctions prolong the war?
I don't think it's a good development. I mean, I saw one calculation that said with the situation now, Russia's probably accumulating maybe $150 million more per day in oil revenues. And the Russians are certainly taking advantage of it. I mean, the war, I think, has given two very tangible benefits to Moscow. One is their oil revenues are up. And bear in mind that at the end of 2025, a lot of the data showed that, in fact, Russian oil revenues were really down significantly compared to 2024. And from my perspective, that's a good thing because those revenues, oil is the main export earner for Russia. And if we can drive those revenues down, that reduces the funding, the resources that Russia has to continue this war. So by loosening the sanctions on Russian oil, we've basically given Putin more capability to finance the war. So I was very disappointed by the administration's decision to do that. I don't think it was necessary. And I think what you see is, I think, a slight degree of panic in the administration about the fact that the war against Iran, because of the impact on closing the Strait of Hormuz, is calling gasoline and oil prices to rise. And they're panicking a bit on that, but I don't think that the decision, therefore, to remove sanctions from Russia was a smart one. The other tangible benefit that I think this gives the Russians is that with the fighting going on now in the Persian Gulf, there is a much higher demand there for things like Patriot air defense missiles and other American missile defense or other American air defense assets. And that means that there are fewer of those missiles, fewer of those assets available to either provide or sell to Ukraine. And that makes it easier then for the Russians to continue to conduct their missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian cities. So this war, I think, has had two very positive impacts for Russia, and they're going to cost Ukraine more.
And do you think that's the main impact of U.S. Israeli operation against Iran on the Russian-Ukraine war?
I think those are the principal two tangible impacts. The, I mean, I think there's one other impact, but I think it's less tangible, and it probably doesn't do much to help Ukraine's situation. And that is, I think we've seen the Russian reaction, very similar to the Russian reaction when American bombers struck struck Iranian nuclear sites last year. Very similar to the Russian reaction when American forces seized Mr. Maduro's in Venezuela. It's basically expressing solidarity with the Russian partner, but taking very limited actions. I mean, it appears that the Russians are providing some intelligence support to Iran. And there's, I think, some reports now that they may even be sending some Iranian Shahed drones back to Iran for the Iranians to use. But I also think that there's probably some in the Kremlin who do worry that American actions in challenging Russian partners make Moscow appear somewhat impotent beyond those countries right on its borders. But I think that feeling in Moscow is far outweighed by the happiness in Moscow that Ukraine now has fewer air defense assets to intercept Russian missiles and drones, and the fact that Russia is now making more money from its oil sales.
Does Ukraine have cards to play, quote unquote, with the United States and other partners in the Persian Gulf in the Iran war?
Yeah, I think they have big cards to play, and they're playing them. I mean, I saw a couple days ago, Ukraine has sent 200 personnel and substantial anti-drone interceptors to, I think, three or four of the Persian Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia. I mean, no country in the world has more experience and better experience than the Ukrainians in how do you deal with Iranian Shahed type drone attacks. And I think it's commendable of Ukraine to be willing to share this. I mean, to the extent that they have 200 people now working in the Persian Gulf, that's 200 people fewer to defend Ukrainian skies. Now, what's a little bit puzzling to me is that it's not clear the United States has taken advantage of President Zelensky's offer to share the technology and this help with the United States. I've seen that the officials have traveled at the request of, I think, three or four of the Gulf countries, but I'm not sure that the U.S. is taking advantage of that. And I think this would be actually something very important for the United States because, as I said, I don't think anybody has more experience or deeper expertise than the Ukrainians in dealing with these attacks using relatively low-cost interceptors. I mean, I think one of the reasons why the Pentagon has now asked for $200 billion is the kind of interceptors that the United States has been using to knock down drones and such are far more expensive than the kind of anti-drone interceptors that the Ukrainians have produced.
Ambassador, we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask a final question. Why do you think President Trump continues to put more pressure to end the war on Ukraine's President Zelensky than on Russia's President Putin?
I sure wish I knew. I mean, it's puzzling, it's disturbing to me that Mr. Trump's default reaction is to say, well, Zelensky has to end the war, and Putin is, willing for peace. And again, I've seen no sign of that willingness for peace. I mean, that willingness for peace, if it was there, would be suggesting that the Russians would be making some efforts to find a compromise, to find a solution that was not just reflective of their own demands, which are really for Ukraine's capitulation. And what I think is, and I think I have to confess, I think Vladimir Putin has been very effective at playing Mr. Trump, at stringing him along. I think what you've seen in the last 7 or 8 months is the Russians taking part in negotiations, never quite saying no to negotiations, but they've been able to fool both Mr. Trump, they've been able to fool his lead negotiator, Stephen Witkoff. And so they create this appearance that they're trying to negotiate. But again, there's been no real movement in a serious way that I think would move this war to some kind of a negotiated settlement. And so I try to figure out what's going on here. And I think, come up with really at this point two plausible theories. One is more psychological, which is that, Mr. Trump likes powerful figures, and somehow he's concluded Putin is a powerful figure. He's more powerful than Zelensky, so he has this natural affinity for Putin, and that actually goes back. I mean, that's not just been in the last year. You can go back and see that going back in his first term. For example, in 2018, when Trump and Putin met in Helsinki, and he came out and he sided with Putin over the conclusions of the U.S. American Intelligence Agency. I mean, that was a fairly bizarre appearance. So I think that's one possible theory, which is more psychological than anything else. The other thing that suggests a strategy that I've heard off and on over the past 14 months is that the Trump administration believes it can build a relationship with Putin and somehow pull Putin away from China's Xi. And if that, in fact, is the strategy, it suggests to me that the White House has no real understanding of the relationship between Russia and China and Putin and Xi. Over the last 3 or 4 years, Russia has become hugely dependent on China. It's now almost an economic vassal state of the Chinese. In ways that, quite frankly, surprised me. I would have thought that the Russians would have been trying to maintain a bit more of their independence. But the idea that somehow we can persuade Vladimir Putin to throw over his relationship with Xi, to place a bet on Donald Trump, who is thoroughly unpredictable and is only going to be in office for another 2 years and 10 months. I mean, the idea that you could achieve that, why would Putin do that? That just makes no sense. So if that is fact is the strategy, and sometimes I've seen people around Trump allude to it, it's a flawed strategy. Yeah, it will fail. We will not be able to drive a wedge between Xi and Putin. And to the extent it means, distancing ourselves from Ukraine, distancing ourselves from Europe, we're going to find if they pursue that strategy that a couple of years down the line, we're going to have many fewer allies and partners willing to go to bat for us if we need them. But other than those two things, it's hard to figure out what motivates the way that the American president now looks at Putin.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynicia.
Thank you for having me.
I have been speaking with Steven Pifer, who was the third United States ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000, and is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe. This episode of Krynicia has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynicia. Until next time, that's all for now.